I never imagined that the mahogany-paneled courtroom of the Hamilton County Courthouse would become the stage for the most devastating revelation of my life. The morning air was thick with tension as I sat beside my lawyer, Margaret Chen, watching the judge shuffle through papers with the methodical precision of someone who had presided over countless family disputes. But this wasn't just another case to me. This was my father's legacy, my family's honor, and my own reputation hanging in the balance. My name is Rebecca Morrison, and for the past 8 months, I had been painted as the villain in my own family's story. The woman who allegedly manipulated her dying father, who whispered poison in his ear during his final days, who convinced him to rewrite his will in her favor. The greedy daughter who cared more about money than love. These were the accusations that had followed me through grocery stores, whispered behind my back at church, and cost me friendships I thought would last forever. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very person spreading these lies was sitting across the courtroom, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, her blonde hair styled in that same page boy cut she'd worn since high school. My sister Victoria had always been the golden child, the one who married well, lived in the right neighborhood, and knew exactly what to say at family gatherings. She was 2 years older than me, and she had never let me forget it. Dad had been gone for 6 months now, and I still found myself reaching for the phone to call him when something funny happened at work or when I needed advice about my teenage daughter Emma's latest crisis. Henry Morrison had been more than just my father. He had been my anchor, my biggest supporter, and the one person who truly understood my quiet nature. While Victoria commanded attention in every room she entered, I preferred the shadows, the comfortable silence of reading a book or working in my garden. The will reading had been a shock to everyone, including me. Dad had left Victoria the family home, a beautiful Victorian mansion on Elm Street that had been in our family for 3 generations. He had left her the antique furniture, the family jewelry, and a substantial sum from his savings account. But he had also left me something unexpected. His business, Morrison and Associates, the accounting firm he had built from nothing over 30 years. I had worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company for the past 15 years, quietly managing numbers and finding a strange peace in the ordered world of financial records. I had never expressed any interest in taking over Dad's firm, never indicated that I wanted anything more than my simple life. But Dad had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. The letter he had left with the will was brief but devastating in its clarity. Rebecca has always had a gift for seeing what others miss. She understands the true value of honest work and careful attention to detail. I trust her to carry on the family business with the integrity it deserves. Victoria has been blessed with many gifts, but business acumen is not one of them. Victoria had been furious, not just disappointed or hurt, but genuinely enraged. She had expected to inherit the business, to either sell it immediately or hire someone to run it while she collected the profits. The idea that Dad had chosen me, his quiet younger daughter, had been incomprehensible to her. That's when the whispers started. Victoria began telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated Dad in his final months, that I had isolated him from the rest of the family, that I had somehow brainwashed him into changing his will. She painted a picture of me as a scheming, calculating woman who had taken advantage of a sick old man's vulnerability. The truth was far more mundane. I had spent time with Dad in his final months. Yes, but not because I was plotting anything. I had simply been there. While Victoria was busy with her social obligations, her country club meetings, and her charity galas, I had been the one driving Dad to his doctor appointments. I had been the one sitting beside his hospital bed when he couldn't sleep, the one who brought him his favorite soup when he was too weak to cook for himself. We had talked during those long afternoons, really talked in a way we never had before. Dad had shared stories about building his business, about the clients who had trusted him with their financial futures, about the satisfaction he found in helping people navigate the complex world of taxes and investments. He had also shared his concerns about Victoria, his worry that she saw money as something to be spent rather than something to be earned and respected. But I had never asked him to change his will. I had never even known he was considering it until the lawyer called us both to his office for the reading. Victoria's campaign against me had been systematic and brutal. She had convinced our Aunt Martha that I was a gold digger. She had persuaded our cousins that I had isolated Dad from his family. She had even managed to turn some of Dad's old friends against me, suggesting that I had prevented them from visiting him in his final days. The culmination of her efforts came when she formally contested the will, claiming that Dad had been mentally incompetent when he wrote it, and that I had exercised undue influence over him. She had hired Bradley Whitmore, one of the most expensive estate attorneys in the state, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to drag cases out for years. The legal battle had been exhausting. Every aspect of my relationship with Dad had been scrutinized, every conversation analyzed, every moment of care I had provided twisted into evidence of manipulation. I had been forced to hire my own attorney, Margaret Chen, a woman with a reputation for quiet competence and unshakable integrity. Margaret had been thorough in her preparation, interviewing Dad's doctors, his neighbors, his business associates. She had gathered evidence of his mental acuity right up until his death, medical records showing no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. She had documented the timeline of his final months, showing that he had been making complex business decisions right up until the end. But Victoria had been equally thorough in her character assassination. She had found witnesses who testified that I had seemed different in Dad's final months, more attentive, more present. She had suggested that this change in behavior was evidence of my ulterior motives. She had even implied that I had kept Dad from seeing his grandchildren, though the truth was that her teenage sons had been too busy with their own lives to visit their grandfather. The trial had been scheduled for a crisp October morning, and as I sat in the courtroom, I felt the weight of 6 months of accusations and whispers pressing down on me. The mahogany walls seemed to close in around me, and the formal portraits of former judges looked down with what felt like judgment in their painted eyes. Judge Patricia Holloway was a woman in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of stern demeanor that came from decades of presiding over family disputes. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for having little patience for dramatics or time-wasting. She had made it clear from the beginning that she wanted this case resolved, quickly and efficiently. Victoria sat across the aisle with her husband Richard, a successful real estate developer who had always treated me with barely concealed condescension. Their 2 sons, Brandon and Tyler, sat behind them, looking uncomfortable in their suits and clearly wishing they were anywhere else. I wondered if they truly believed their mother's version of events, or if they were simply supporting her out of family loyalty. My own support system was smaller, but no less meaningful. My daughter, Emma, now 17 and fierce in her loyalty, sat directly behind me. She had been furious about the accusations against me, had wanted to confront Victoria directly, but I had convinced her that the truth would come out in court. Beside Emma sat my best friend Carol, a woman who had known me since college, and who had witnessed firsthand the genuine grief I had experienced after Dad's death. The proceedings began with opening statements. Bradley Whitmore painted me as a master manipulator, a woman who had cynically exploited her father's loneliness and failing health for financial gain. He spoke of how I had gradually isolated Dad from his family, how I had filled his head with lies about Victoria's motives, how I had taken advantage of his vulnerability to secure my own financial future. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered similar speeches many times before, "this is not a complex case. It is a simple story of greed overcoming family loyalty. Rebecca Morrison saw an opportunity when her father became ill, and she seized it with calculated precision. She knew that Henry Morrison was generous to a fault, that he wanted to believe the best about his children. She exploited that generosity, that love, for her own selfish ends. Margaret's opening statement was quieter but no less powerful. She spoke of the genuine relationship I had shared with Dad, of the hours I had spent caring for him, not because I wanted something from him, but because I loved him. She painted a picture of a man who had made his final decisions with full mental capacity, who had chosen to leave his business to the daughter he believed could best preserve his legacy. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice steady and clear, "Henry Morrison was not a man easily fooled or manipulated. He was a successful businessman who had spent decades reading people, understanding their motivations, recognizing their strengths and weaknesses. His decision to leave his business to Rebecca was not the result of manipulation. It was the result of a father's clear-eyed assessment of his daughter's abilities and character. The first day of testimony was grueling. Victoria took the stand and delivered a performance that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. She spoke of her love for Dad, of her shock at being essentially cut out of his business, of her growing realization that something was wrong in his final months. "I noticed that Rebecca was always there," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Every time I called Dad, she was there. Every time I wanted to visit, she had some excuse about why it wasn't a good time. She was controlling his schedule, controlling his access to the rest of the family." The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria, who had rarely visited Dad before his illness, was now claiming that she had been prevented from seeing him. Victoria, who had been too busy with her social obligations to drive him to doctor appointments, was now suggesting that my presence had been somehow sinister. When it came time for my cross-examination, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Every word I spoke seemed to be weighed and measured, every emotion analyzed for signs of deception. I spoke about my love for Dad, about the natural way I had stepped up to help him when he needed care, about the conversations we had shared that had nothing to do with money or inheritances. "Ms. Morrison," Whitmore said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "isn't it true that you stood to gain significantly from your father's death?" "I stood to lose the most important person in my life," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "The business was never something I asked for or expected, but you accepted it readily enough, didn't you? I accepted the responsibility that Dad entrusted to me." The questions continued for what felt like hours, each one designed to make me appear calculating and cold. But I held to the truth, even when it made me seem naive or unprepared. I had loved my father. I had cared for him in his final months, not because I wanted something from him, but because he needed me. And I had been as surprised as anyone when the will was read. The second day brought character witnesses. Victoria had assembled an impressive array of people who testified to her generous nature, her love for Dad, her shock at being excluded from his business. She had their Aunt Martha, who spoke of how Victoria had always been the more responsible daughter, more involved in family affairs, more suited to handle financial matters. She had Mrs. Peterson, Dad's elderly neighbor, who testified that she had seen me at Dad's house frequently in his final months, and that she had thought it was a bit odd how often I was there. She had Dr. Williams, Dad's cardiologist, who admitted that Dad had seemed somewhat withdrawn in his final visits, though he couldn't say whether this was due to his illness or other factors. But Margaret had done her homework too. She presented testimony from Dad's business partner, Frank Rodriguez, who spoke of how Dad had praised my attention to detail and my natural understanding of financial matters. She had testimony from Dad's primary care physician, Dr. Sarah Kim, who stated unequivocally that Dad had shown no signs of cognitive decline and had been making complex decisions about his medical care right up until his death. Most powerfully, she had testimony from Helen Garcia, Dad's housekeeper for the past 10 years. Helen was a small, elderly woman who spoke with a slight accent and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of honest work. She testified that Dad had often spoken of his pride in both his daughters, but that he had also expressed concerns about Victoria's spending habits and her tendency to see money as something to be enjoyed rather than respected. Mr. Morrison, he was very worried about the business, Helen said, her voice soft but clear. He say to me many times, "Helen, Victoria is a good girl, but she don't understand what it takes to build something. She only know how to spend. He say, Rebecca, she understand the value of hard work." Victoria's face had grown pale during Helen's testimony, but she maintained her composure, occasionally whispering to her attorney or shaking her head sadly, as if she were disappointed in Helen's betrayal. The third day brought the technical evidence. Margaret presented medical records showing Dad's mental acuity, business records showing his continued involvement in complex financial decisions, and a timeline demonstrating that his decision to change his will had been made over a period of months, not in a moment of weakness or confusion. But Victoria's attorney had his own technical evidence. He presented phone records showing the frequency of my calls to Dad in his final months, suggesting that this represented an unusual level of contact. He presented financial records showing the value of the business Dad had left to me, implying that I had been well aware of what I stood to gain. The most damaging moment came when Whitmore presented a recorded phone conversation between Dad and his attorney, discussing the will changes. In the recording, Dad's voice sounded tired and weak, and there were long pauses between his responses. Whitmore suggested that these pauses indicated confusion or uncertainty, that Dad was not fully competent to make such important decisions. Margaret countered by presenting the full context of the recording, showing that Dad's responses, while slow, were coherent and well-reasoned. She also presented the attorney's notes from the meeting, in which he had specifically noted that Dad appeared to be of sound mind and was making decisions without any apparent coercion. By the end of the third day, I felt emotionally drained. The constant scrutiny, the suggestion that every act of love I had shown Dad was actually manipulation, the implication that I was the kind of person who would exploit a dying man's vulnerability. It was almost more than I could bear. Emma had been a constant source of strength, holding my hand during the most difficult moments, reminding me that she knew who I really was. Carol had been equally supportive, taking time off work to be with me in court, bringing me coffee and tissues and quiet reassurance. But I could see the doubt in some faces in the courtroom. Victoria's performance had been convincing, and she had managed to plant seeds of suspicion about my motives. The judge maintained her professional demeanor, giving no indication of which way she was leaning, but I could feel the case slipping away from me. That evening, as I sat in my small apartment reviewing the day's testimony with Margaret, I felt a despair that went beyond the potential loss of the business. Win or lose, my reputation in this small town was probably damaged beyond repair. Victoria had succeeded in painting me as a gold digger, and that image would likely follow me for the rest of my life. "We have one more day," Margaret said, reviewing her notes. "I want to put you back on the stand, let you tell your story in your own words, without the aggressive cross-examination. Just speak from the heart about your relationship with your father." I nodded. though I wasn't sure I had any heart left to speak from. The process had been so brutal, so dehumanizing, that I felt like a shell of myself. The fourth day dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. As I dressed for what would likely be the final day of testimony, I found myself thinking about Dad, about the quiet conversations we had shared, about the trust he had placed in me. Whatever happened in court today, I knew I had honored that trust to the best of my ability. The courtroom was packed for the final day. Word had spread through town about the dramatic family dispute, and it seemed like half the community had come to witness the conclusion. I recognized faces from church, from the grocery store, from Emma's school. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious, but all were clearly invested in the outcome. Margaret called me back to the stand, and I felt every eye in the room focused on me. This was my final chance to tell my story, to explain who I really was, and what my relationship with Dad had truly been like. "Rebecca," Margaret said gently, "I want you to tell the court about your father, not as a business owner or a wealthy man, but as a person. What was Henry Morrison like?" I took a deep breath and tried to find the words to capture the essence of the man who had shaped my life. He was steady, I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. He was the kind of person who kept his word, who showed up when he said he would, who believed that how you treated people mattered more than what you accomplished. I spoke about his integrity, about how he had built his business on trust and personal relationships rather than aggressive sales tactics. I spoke about his quiet generosity, about how he had helped clients who were struggling financially, sometimes reducing his fees or providing services for free when he knew someone was in genuine need. He wasn't perfect, I continued, feeling more confident as I spoke. He could be stubborn, and he had very strong opinions about right and wrong, but he was also incredibly fair. He never made decisions based on emotion or favoritism. He always tried to do what he thought was best for everyone involved. Margaret asked me about the changes in Dad's final months, about whether I had noticed any decline in his mental abilities. I was able to speak honestly about this, about how his body had grown weaker but his mind had remained sharp. I spoke about the business conversations we had had, about how he had explained complex financial strategies to me, about how he had continued to advise clients and make important decisions right up until his death. "Did you ever ask your father to change his will?" Margaret asked. "Never," I replied firmly. "I didn't even know he was considering it until after he died." "Did you ever discuss with him what you might do with the business if you inherited it?" "No, we never had that conversation. The first time I really thought about running the business was when the lawyer called me to his office for the will reading." Margaret's questions continued for nearly an hour, allowing me to paint a complete picture of my relationship with Dad and my genuine surprise at inheriting the business. I spoke about my fears about taking over such a complex operation, about my commitment to preserving the integrity that Dad had built into the company, about my plans to honor the trust he had placed in me. When Margaret finished her questioning, I braced myself for Whitmore's cross-examination, but instead of the aggressive attack I had expected, he seemed almost perfunctory, as if he were going through the motions rather than trying to destroy my credibility. "Ms. Morrison," he said, "you've painted a very touching picture of your relationship with your father, but the fact remains that you stood to gain significantly from his death, correct?" "I stood to gain a tremendous responsibility," I replied. "The business isn't just an asset. It's a trust that Dad placed in me, and I take that very seriously. But you can't deny that the business has significant financial value." "I can't deny that, no. But I can say that the financial value was never what mattered to me. What mattered was preserving what Dad had built and continuing to serve the clients who had trusted him. Whitmore seemed to sense that this line of questioning wasn't working in his favor, and he quickly wrapped up his cross-examination. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt like I had finally been able to tell my story, truthfully and completely. Victoria's attorney called a few rebuttal witnesses, people who questioned my ability to run a complex business, who suggested that Dad's decision had been impulsive and poorly thought out. But their testimony felt weak compared to the emotional weight of my own words and the technical evidence Margaret had presented. Then came the moment that would change everything. Margaret approached the judge's bench with a manila folder that I hadn't seen before. "Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence that I believe is crucial to this case. I would like to present Henry Morrison's private banking records from the final months of his life." Whitmore immediately objected, arguing that the banking records were irrelevant to the question of Dad's mental competency and my alleged manipulation. But Margaret argued that the records were directly relevant to the question of who had truly been influencing Dad in his final months. Judge Holloway reviewed the documents briefly, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Please present your evidence, Ms. Chen." Margaret handed copies of the banking records to Whitmore, to me, and to the judge. As I scanned the documents, my heart began to race. There, highlighted in yellow, was a transaction I had never seen before. A transfer of $75,000 from Dad's account to an account I didn't recognize, dated just 2 weeks before his death. But it wasn't the transaction itself that made my blood run cold. It was the memo line. "For your silence." Margaret stood before the judge and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Your Honor, these records show a significant financial transaction that occurred in the final weeks of Henry Morrison's life. As you can see, he transferred $75,000 to an account belonging to Victoria Morrison Whitfield, with the notation, 'For your silence.'" The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. I turned to look at Victoria, who had gone completely pale. Her hands were shaking as she stared at the documents in front of her attorney. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, "this evidence suggests that Victoria Morrison Whitfield was not the innocent victim of her father's alleged manipulation that she has claimed to be. Instead, it appears that she was engaged in some form of financial arrangement with her father that required her silence about something." Judge Holloway called for order in the courtroom, then turned to look directly at Victoria. "Ms. Morrison Whitfield, would you like to explain this transaction?" Victoria sat frozen for a moment, her face ashen. Then, without saying a word, she stood up and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the polished floor like a countdown to some inevitable conclusion. Her husband Richard hurried after her, and her 2 sons followed, looking confused and embarrassed. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of the door closing behind them. Judge Holloway looked at Whitmore, who was frantically shuffling through papers as if he might find some explanation for what had just occurred. "Mr. Whitmore, does your client intend to return to explain this evidence?" Whitmore looked toward the door, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, I was not aware of this transaction. I need to consult with my client before proceeding." "Miss Whitmore, your client has just walked out of my courtroom in the middle of proceedings. Unless she returns immediately to explain this evidence, I will assume that she has no explanation to offer." Whitmore gathered his papers and hurried out of the courtroom, leaving me sitting with Margaret, trying to process what had just happened. Margaret leaned over and whispered to me, "I received these records from your father's bank yesterday afternoon. The bank had been holding them as part of their own internal investigation into unusual transactions. When I saw this transfer, I knew we had to present it to the court. But what does it mean?" I whispered back. What was Dad paying Victoria to keep quiet about? I don't know, Margaret replied. But whatever it was, it certainly calls into question her portrayal of herself as the innocent victim in this case. Judge Holloway waited another 10 minutes, but Victoria did not return. Finally, she called both attorneys to the bench for a brief conference, then addressed the courtroom. Given the evidence presented today, and the plaintiff's decision to leave the courtroom without explanation, I am prepared to rule on this matter. The contest of Henry Morrison's will is denied. The will shall be probated as originally written. The judge continued with the technical details of her ruling, but I barely heard them. I was thinking about that $75,000 transfer, about what Dad might have discovered about Victoria in his final weeks, about what secret she had been paid to keep. As the courtroom emptied, I sat with Margaret, Emma, and Carol, trying to process what had just happened. I had won the case, but the victory felt hollow. My family was destroyed, probably permanently. Victoria would never forgive me for exposing whatever secret she had been hiding, and I would probably never learn what Dad had discovered about her. Mom, Emma said, taking my hand. I'm proud of you. You stood up for the truth, even when it was hard. Carol nodded in agreement. Rebecca, you handled yourself with dignity through all of this. Your father would be proud. Margaret was more practical. Rebecca, you need to think about what comes next. You have a business to run, employees who are counting on you, clients who need your services. Don't let this family drama distract you from the real work ahead. She was right, of course. Whatever Victoria had been hiding, whatever she had done to earn that $75,000 payment, it was in the past now. I had a future to build, a business to run, a legacy to preserve. Over the following weeks, I gradually learned more about what had happened in Dad's final months. Frank Rodriguez, Dad's business partner, told me that Dad had discovered some irregularities in the family foundation that Victoria had been managing. Apparently, she had been using foundation funds for personal expenses, including a family vacation to Europe and renovations to her home. Dad had confronted her about it, and she had promised to repay the money and reform her practices. The $75,000 transfer had been his way of helping her cover the repayment without having to admit her mistakes to the rest of the family or to the foundation's board. The silence he had bought was her agreement not to challenge his will or create family drama after his death. Ironically, by contesting the will, she had violated the very agreement she had been paid to honor. I never spoke to Victoria again after that day in court. She and her family moved to Florida 6 months later, and I heard through mutual friends that she had started over there, away from the whispers and judgment of our small town. The business proved to be everything Dad had believed it could be in my hands. My attention to detail, my careful approach to financial planning, and my genuine care for clients turned out to be exactly what the company needed. Within 2 years, we had expanded to a second location and hired 3 additional staff members. Emma graduated from high school and decided to study business in college, with the eventual goal of joining me in the family company. She had inherited her grandfather's head for numbers and her mother's careful attention to relationships, and I knew she would be a valuable addition to the team. The personal cost of the legal battle was significant. Many of the friendships I had lost during Victoria's campaign against me never recovered. Some people in town continued to view me with suspicion, wondering if there was more to the story than what had come out in court. But I also gained something valuable from the experience. I learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, that I could stand up for the truth even when it was difficult, that I could handle responsibility and pressure that I had never expected to face. More importantly, I learned that Dad had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. He had recognized not just my ability to manage numbers and handle details, but my capacity for integrity, for putting the needs of others before my own interests, for building something lasting rather than just profitable. The business became more than just a source of income. It became a way of honoring Dad's memory, of carrying forward his values, of serving the community that had shaped both of us. Every client I helped, every financial plan I developed, every tax return I prepared, was a way of continuing the work he had started. One day, about 3 years after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria. She was calling from Florida, and her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less confident than the woman who had stood in court and accused me of manipulation. "Rebecca," she said, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. I was wrong about what I said about you and Dad. I was angry and hurt, and I said things that weren't true." I listened in silence, not sure how to respond. "I know you're probably wondering about the money," she continued. "Dad found out about some mistakes I made with the foundation. I wasn't trying to steal anything, I got careless with the paperwork, and some personal expenses got mixed up with foundation business. Dad helped me fix it, but he was disappointed in me." "Victoria," I said finally, "I appreciate you calling, but I know it's too late to fix things between us." She interrupted. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry, but I wanted you to know that Dad was right about the business. You're doing a good job with it. I hear about it sometimes, from people who knew us back home. He would be proud of you." After she hung up, I sat in Dad's old office, looking at the photos on his desk of both his daughters at various ages. In one picture, Victoria and I were about 8 and 10, standing together in front of the Christmas tree, our arms around each other, both grinning at the camera. I wondered when we had stopped being sisters and started being rivals, when love had been replaced by resentment and competition. But I also realized that the pain of losing my relationship with Victoria was part of the price of growing into the person Dad had believed I could become. Sometimes standing up for the truth meant losing people you love. Sometimes integrity came at the cost of relationships that had been built on false foundations. The business continued to thrive, and I found a satisfaction in the work that I had never experienced in my previous job. There was something deeply fulfilling about helping people plan for their futures, about guiding them through complex financial decisions, about being trusted with their most important concerns. I also discovered that I had a talent for mentoring younger employees, for teaching them not just the technical aspects of accounting and financial planning, but the importance of integrity, attention to detail, and genuine care for clients. Dad's values lived on not just in me, but in the people I trained and the culture we built together. Emma joined the business after college, and watching her learn the ropes, seeing her interact with clients with the same careful attention and genuine concern that had characterized Dad's approach, I knew that the legacy would continue beyond my own involvement. The trial had been a crucible, a painful but necessary process that had revealed the truth about my family and about myself. I had learned that I was capable of standing up under pressure, of maintaining my integrity even when it was difficult, of building something meaningful from the trust that had been placed in me. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the people who love us most can see potential in us that we don't see in ourselves. Dad had recognized something in me that I hadn't recognized, had trusted me with a responsibility that I hadn't thought I was ready for, had believed in my ability to grow into the person he knew I could become. The courtroom drama had lasted only 4 days, but its effects had shaped the rest of my life. I had walked in as a woman accused of manipulation and greed, and I had walked out as someone who had been trusted with preserving a legacy of integrity and service. No one had called me greedy since that day in court. Instead, I had become known as someone who could be trusted, someone who put principle before profit, someone who honored the faith that had been placed in her. The empty chair at family gatherings, the silence where Victoria's voice had once been, the loss of the sister I had thought I knew. These were the costs of standing up for the truth. But the business that thrived under my leadership, the clients whose financial futures I helped secure, the employees who learned from my example, the daughter who carried forward the values her grandfather had instilled in me. These were the rewards of living up to the trust that had been placed in me. In the end, the trial had been about more than just money or property or family rivalry. It had been about the kind of person I was willing to become, the kind of legacy I was willing to build, the kind of life I was willing to live. And sitting in Dad's office, looking at the photos of his daughters, I knew that I had made the right choice. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. I had discovered who I really was, and I had found the strength to become who I was meant to be. The inheritance had been more than just a business. It had been an opportunity to grow, to serve, to honor the values that had shaped me. And in accepting that inheritance, I had inherited not just Dad's company, but his integrity, his commitment to excellence, and his belief in the importance of doing what was right, regardless of the cost. That was the real legacy he had left me, and it was worth more than any amount of money Victoria could have contested in court. The years that followed the trial brought unexpected discoveries about myself and about the hidden depths of the business Dad had entrusted to me. What I had initially seen as a simple accounting firm was actually a complex network of relationships, trust, and community service that extended far beyond what I had ever imagined. 3 months after the trial, I was going through Dad's personal office files when I discovered a locked drawer in his desk. Inside, I found a collection of letters from clients, some dating back 20 years, thanking him for services that went far beyond traditional accounting. There were thank you notes from a young couple whose small business Dad had helped save during a difficult recession, letters from elderly clients whose estates he had protected from predatory schemes, and handwritten notes from families whose financial futures he had secured through careful planning and genuine care. One letter particularly caught my attention. It was from Maria Santos, a single mother who had cleaned offices in the same building where Dad's firm was located. She had written to thank him for helping her navigate the complex process of starting her own cleaning business, for doing her taxes for free during her first struggling years, and for believing in her potential when no one else would. As I read Maria's letter, I realized that I had been seeing her around town for years without really noticing her. She was the quiet woman who cleaned the bank after hours, who worked multiple jobs to support her 3 children, who had somehow transformed her life from minimum wage worker to successful business owner. Dad had been part of that transformation, had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. The letter ended with a line that made me pause. "Mr. Morrison, you didn't just help me with my taxes. You helped me believe that someone like me could build something meaningful. You saw potential in me that I didn't know existed." I realized that this was the same gift Dad had given me. He had seen potential in me that I hadn't recognized, had trusted me with a responsibility that I hadn't thought I was ready for, had believed in my ability to grow into someone I hadn't known I could become. But more than that, I realized that this was the true nature of the business he had left me. It wasn't just about preparing tax returns or managing financial records. It was about recognizing hidden potential in people, about helping them see possibilities they hadn't considered, about being the person who believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves. Over the following months, I began to understand that Dad had been training me for this role without either of us fully realizing it. All those afternoons we had spent together in his final months, all those conversations about his clients and their stories, all those moments when he had shared his philosophy about business and life, They had been preparing me not just to manage his company, but to carry forward his mission of seeing and nurturing the potential in others. I started paying closer attention to the people who came through our doors. There was James Mitchell, a construction worker who had been injured on the job and was struggling to figure out how to support his family on disability payments. During our meetings, I noticed that he had an intuitive understanding of complex financial concepts, that he asked questions that revealed a sharp, analytical mind beneath his worried exterior. "James," I said during one of our sessions, "have you ever thought about going back to school? You have a real gift for understanding financial systems." He looked at me with surprise. "Ma'am, I never finished high school. I'm not smart enough for college. Intelligence isn't about formal education," I replied, echoing something Dad had once told me. "It's about how you think, how you process information, how you solve problems. You've got those abilities." Over the next year, I helped James explore his options. We worked together to map out a plan for him to get his GED and then pursue an associate degree in business. I connected him with financial aid resources and helped him understand how to balance his studies with his family responsibilities. When James graduated with honors 2 years later, he sent me a photo of himself at the ceremony, wearing his cap and gown, with his wife and 2 young children beside him. On the back, he had written, "Thank you for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself." There was Patricia Williams, a divorced mother of 3 who had been working as a part-time bookkeeper for several small businesses. She came to me for help with her own taxes, but during our conversations I realized that she had developed sophisticated systems for managing multiple sets of books, that she had created innovative solutions for common accounting problems, and that her clients trusted her with their most sensitive financial information. "Patricia," I said, "you're not just a bookkeeper. You're a financial consultant. You have skills that businesses need, and you're undervaluing yourself." She shook her head. "I don't have the credentials for that kind of work. I learned everything on the job." "Experience is a credential," I replied. "What you've learned through practical application is often more valuable than what someone learns in a classroom." I helped Patricia understand the full scope of her abilities and encouraged her to start her own consulting practice. I provided her with references, helped her develop marketing materials, and supported her through the transition from employee to entrepreneur. Within 6 months, Patricia had established a thriving practice specializing in financial systems for small businesses. She had discovered a confidence she never knew she possessed, a professional identity that matched her actual skills and abilities. "Rebecca," she told me during one of our follow-up meetings, "I always thought I was just getting by, just doing what I had to do to pay the bills. You helped me realize that I was actually building something valuable, that I had expertise that people needed." These experiences taught me that the most meaningful part of my work wasn't the technical aspects of accounting or financial planning. It was the moment when I could help someone see their own potential, when I could be the person who believed in them before they believed in themselves. I began to understand that this was what Dad had been doing all along. He hadn't just been running an accounting firm. He had been creating a space where people could discover their own hidden strengths, where they could be seen and valued for who they really were, rather than who they appeared to be on the surface. The business grew not just because of our technical expertise, but because of our approach to relationships. Clients began referring friends and family members not just because we were competent accountants, but because we saw them as whole people with untapped potential, rather than just as collections of financial data. Emma's involvement in the business brought a fresh perspective that I hadn't anticipated. She had grown up watching Dad's quiet influence on people's lives, had witnessed my own transformation from shy bookkeeper to confident business owner, and she brought to the work a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life. "Mom," she said one day, "I've been thinking about what makes our firm different from others. It's not just that we're good at numbers. It's that we help people see possibilities they didn't know existed." She was right. We had become a place where people came not just for financial services, but for a kind of professional validation, for someone to recognize their worth and potential. We had clients who had started businesses, gone back to school, changed careers, and made major life decisions based partly on conversations they had had in our office. There was Robert Chen, a restaurant worker who had been sending money to his family overseas for years, carefully managing his finances despite earning minimal wages. During our meetings, I realized that he had developed an sophisticated understanding of international finance, currency exchange, and long-term financial planning. "Robert," I said, "you understand global financial systems better than many people with business degrees. Have you ever considered working in international finance?" He looked skeptical. "I work in a kitchen. I don't have the education for that kind of job." "You have the practical knowledge," I replied. "That's often more valuable than theoretical education." I helped Robert explore opportunities in international business, connected him with language schools to improve his English, and introduced him to professionals in the field who could provide guidance and mentorship. 2 years later, Robert was working for a major bank's international division, using his practical knowledge of currency exchange and international money transfers to help other immigrants navigate complex financial systems. He had discovered a career path that utilized skills he had developed naturally, but had never recognized as professional assets. These stories became the foundation of our firm's reputation. We weren't just the place you went to get your taxes done. We were the place you went to discover what you were capable of achieving. Word spread through the community about the quiet woman who had taken over her father's business and was helping people see their own potential. The transformation wasn't just in our clients, it was in me as well. I began to understand that my years of quietly observing people, of paying attention to details that others missed, of seeing patterns and connections that weren't immediately obvious. These weren't just personality traits. They were professional skills that enabled me to help people in ways that more traditional approaches might miss. I started speaking at local business groups, sharing stories about the hidden potential that existed in every community, about the importance of seeing people as more than their current circumstances suggested. I developed workshops on financial literacy that were really about helping people recognize their own capabilities and envision broader possibilities for their futures. The firm expanded to include not just traditional accounting services, but also financial coaching, career transition support, and small business development assistance. We became a resource for people who were ready to make changes in their lives, but weren't sure how to begin. Margaret Chen, the attorney who had represented me during the trial, became not just a professional colleague but a close friend. She had been impressed by the way I had handled myself under pressure, by my commitment to truth and integrity, even when it was difficult. "Rebecca," she said one day over coffee, "you've become someone completely different from the woman I met 2 years ago. You've found your voice, your confidence, your sense of purpose." She was right. The trial had been a crucible that had burned away my old assumptions about myself and revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. The responsibility Dad had entrusted to me had required me to grow into someone I hadn't been before. Someone who could handle pressure, make difficult decisions, and inspire others to believe in their own potential. The relationship with Victoria remained complicated and painful. We had exchanged a few letters over the years, tentative attempts at reconciliation that never quite achieved the warmth we had shared as children. The secret of the $75,000 transfer had created a barrier between us that seemed impossible to fully overcome. But I had learned to live with that loss, to understand that some relationships couldn't survive the revelation of truth, that integrity sometimes came at the cost of comfort and familiarity. The sister I had lost had been built on a foundation of assumptions and illusions that couldn't withstand the pressures of real life. In her place, I had found a different kind of family, in the community of people whose lives I had been privileged to touch. There was a network of former clients who had become friends, of employees who had become colleagues in the deepest sense, of community members who had come to trust me with their dreams and aspirations. 5 years after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor at the office. It was Helen Garcia, Dad's former housekeeper, now well into her 70s but still sharp and observant. "Miss Rebecca," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I want to tell you something. Your father, he would be very proud of what you've done here." She went on to explain that she had been hearing stories around town about the people I had helped, about the lives that had been changed through our work. She had come to tell me that Dad had been right about my potential, that he had seen something in me that had taken time to fully emerge. "He used to say," Helen continued, "that the best thing you can do for someone is help them see who they really are. He said you had that gift, that you noticed things about people that they didn't notice about themselves." As Helen spoke, I realized that Dad had been preparing me for this work, long before either of us had fully understood what that preparation would lead to. All those years of watching him interact with clients, of seeing how he balanced technical expertise with genuine care for people, of witnessing his quiet influence on the community. They had been teaching me not just about business, but about the deeper purpose that could drive a professional life. The business continued to grow, but more importantly, it continued to evolve. We developed programs for high school students who were planning for college, helping them understand not just the financial aspects of higher education, but also the importance of choosing paths that aligned with their natural abilities and interests. We created workshops for adults who were considering career changes, providing not just financial planning services, but also helping them identify transferable skills they might not have recognized in themselves. We partnered with local community organizations to provide financial literacy education that was really about empowerment, about helping people see that they had more control over their futures than they might have believed. Emma had become a full partner in the business, bringing her own unique perspective and energy to the work. She had inherited Dad's eye for detail and my intuitive understanding of people, but she had also developed her own approach to client relationships that was more direct and contemporary than either of ours had been. "Mom," she said one day, "I've been thinking about expanding our services to include life coaching. So many of our clients come to us with financial questions, but what they really need is help figuring out what they want their lives to look like." She was right. We had become a place where people came not just for financial services, but for a kind of professional counseling, for someone to help them think through major life decisions and see possibilities they hadn't considered. The expansion into life coaching felt like a natural evolution of the work we had been doing all along. We brought in additional staff with backgrounds in psychology and counseling, created programs that integrated financial planning with personal development, and developed a reputation as a place where people could get help, not just with their money, but with their dreams. The success of the business was gratifying, but what I found most meaningful was the ongoing opportunity to witness people's transformations. There was something deeply satisfying about being present for the moment when someone realized their own potential, when they understood that they were capable of more than they had imagined. I thought often about the woman I had been before Dad's death, the quiet bookkeeper who had assumed that her life would continue in the same comfortable but limited patterns it had always followed. That woman had been content with invisibility, with being overlooked, with accepting other people's assessments of her capabilities. The trial had forced me to find my voice, to stand up for myself, to demonstrate strength and integrity under pressure. But the real transformation had come in the years since, as I had learned to use those newly discovered abilities in service of others, to become the person who saw and nurtured potential in other people. I had become the person Dad had always believed I could be. But more than that, I had become the person I had never known I wanted to be. The responsibility he had entrusted to me had revealed not just my professional capabilities, but my deeper purpose, my reason for being in the world. The business had become more than a way to make a living. It had become a way to make a difference. Every client who discovered their own potential, every person who found the courage to pursue a dream they had thought was impossible, every individual who learned to see themselves as more than their current circumstances suggested, they were all part of a larger mission that had grown out of Dad's original vision for what a business could be. 10 years after the trial, I was invited to speak at a conference on small business development. As I stood before an audience of entrepreneurs and business owners, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to that moment. 10 years ago, I began, I was a bookkeeper who thought she understood her own limitations. I had accepted other people's assessments of my abilities, had resigned myself to a life of quiet competence but limited impact. I never imagined that I was capable of running a business, of inspiring others, of making a difference in my community. I spoke about the inheritance that had been more than financial, about the responsibility that had required me to grow into someone I hadn't been before, about the discovery that potential often lies hidden beneath the surface of our assumptions about ourselves and others. The most important thing I've learned, I concluded, is that everyone has abilities they don't fully recognize, dreams they've dismissed as impossible, potential they've never had the opportunity to explore. Our job, as business owners and community members, is to help people see who they really are, to believe in their capabilities before they believe in themselves. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. Afterward, dozens of people approached me to share their own stories of hidden potential, of dreams deferred, of capabilities they had never fully recognized. I realized that my experience wasn't unique, that there were countless people who had been overlooked, underestimated, or simply never given the opportunity to discover what they were capable of achieving. That conference led to additional speaking opportunities, to consulting work with other businesses that wanted to develop more meaningful relationships with their clients, to partnerships with educational institutions that were interested in helping students understand their own potential. The firm had evolved into something far beyond what Dad had originally created, but it had remained true to his fundamental philosophy. That business should be about more than profit, that professional relationships should be built on genuine care and respect, that everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they really are. Emma had taken on more responsibility in the day-to-day operations, allowing me to focus on the strategic vision and community outreach that had become increasingly important to our mission. She had developed her own client base, her own approach to helping people discover their potential, her own reputation as someone who could see possibilities that others missed. "Mom," she said one evening as we were closing the office, "I've been thinking about what Grandpa would think of what we've built here. Do you think he ever imagined it would become what it is today?" I considered her question carefully. "I think he saw the potential for it," I replied. "He understood that business could be a vehicle for helping people, for building community, for making a difference in the world. He planted the seeds, and we've been helping them grow. Auckland, the truth was that Dad had given me more than a business. He had given me a mission, a purpose, a way to use my natural abilities in service of something larger than myself. The inheritance had been transformative not because of its financial value, but because of the responsibility it had required me to accept, the growth it had demanded from me, the person it had enabled me to become. As I locked the office door that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to that moment. The quiet woman who had been overlooked for so many years had discovered that she had a voice, that she had insights worth sharing, that she had the ability to help others see their own potential. The trial had been the beginning of that transformation, but the real work had been in the years since, as I had learned to use the strength and integrity I had discovered in myself to build something meaningful, something that honored Dad's memory while creating new possibilities for the future. The inheritance had been more than property or money. It had been an invitation to become who I was meant to be, to use my gifts in service of others, to carry forward a legacy of seeing and nurturing the potential that exists in every person. That was the true value of what Dad had left me, and it was a gift that would continue to multiply through every life we touched, every dream we helped someone pursue, every person we helped see their own hidden potential.